If you got wedding plans on your agenda for 2026, you're excited for it, first off, congratulations. But second, maybe consider planning through Simply Eloped. They've planned over 14,000 personalized ceremonies in 37 beautiful U.S. destinations. You've got enough on your plate for next year, so let Simply Eloped coordinate every detail with care. All you got to do is bring the marriage license. Create your kind of wedding at simplyeloped.com. Today on CityCast Chicago, as we look back on this year's milestones, we also remember 2025 marked 25 years since Mayor Richard M. Daley launched his infamous plan for transformation, tearing down the city's public housing high-rises. So we're revisiting a conversation we had this summer about how Chicago is still feeling the effects of the broken promises left behind. It's Monday, December 29th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago is talking about. It has been 30 years since Chicago began tearing down its high-rises and public housing complexes, and 25 years since the city packaged that and renamed it the Plan for Transformation. Joining me to talk more is professor and author Natalie Moore. Welcome back to the podcast, my friend.
Thanks for having me, as always.
We've also got investigative reporter Mick Dumke in the building. Mick, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, great to be here. Thank you.
So, Natalie, I'm going to start with a simple but very complex question. What is the Plan for Transformation, at least in theory? What was it?
It's this overarching term that was remaking Chicago public high-rises, tearing them down to make way for mixed income communities. The idea was that you had this concentrated poverty in places like Cabrini Green, Henry Horner, Robert Taylor, Stateway Gardens. And some of these were the poorest census tracts in the entire nation. They were isolated physically, and I would even say emotionally, from the rest of the city. And so Mayor Richard Daley, M. Daley, did something really unprecedented. He went to Congress and said, give me back control of the housing authority and let me do this ambitious plan that at the time I think was supposed to take 5 years and 10 years and then so on and so forth. But the idea was renovating or rebuilding public housing.
Mick, Natalie mentions Mayor Daley going to Congress to get back control of the Chicago Housing Authority. Why did he need to do that? Can you kind of talk about the state of CHA during the 90s and mid 90s leading up to this ambitious plan?
Yeah, I think you would even have to go back a little before that. I think by the 70s and 80s, the CHA was just rife with problems. And I'm not talking about the properties themselves, the apartment buildings, although that was also the case, but the management, the politics. The CHA was a real mess. Under President Bill Clinton, the federal government took over the CHA for a number of years. And so they basically took away local control of all of the public housing here. By the mid to late 90s, Richard M. Daley was in talks with the federal government to take back control of the Chicago Housing Authority. And as part of that deal, they started to map out the Plan for Transformation, as it came to be called, which Natalie was just describing.
You know, Jacoby, one thing that we didn't talk about, I mean, we all kind of know this story, but what was the precursor to the Plan for Transformation? And, you know, Mick's look back about, what was your headline? The shot that
brought the projects down.
Killing of the young man walking with his mom. I remember Natalie and I talked about that.
Yes, Dantrell Davis. Shot in the forehead while his mom was holding his hand, walking him to school in 1992. My argument was that was a precipitating event. There had been talk for a while about all the things we're discussing now, trying to find ways politically to justify tearing down all the high rises and moving toward a mixed income model. And that was one of a few incidents, I argue the most dramatic and horrifying, that politicians kind of used to move into the plan for transformation ultimately.
Natalie, do you have a sense of how the thousands upon thousands of Chicagoans who lived in public housing at the time, how they reacted to this plan? As we've both, as all of us have kind of covered to this point, the CHA tearing down high rises, this process had already started, but this idea of completely tearing down public housing, replacing it with mixed income living, how did residents react to these proclamations?
Unhappily and distrustful. And there is archival tape. There's this really good documentary done by Bruce Orenstein, who did the documentary series, The Shame of Chicago, about housing segregation. And it was...
Those community meetings are heated.
Yeah, so he did a documentary that was really in the voices of residents, and he had all this footage. They were raucous, and rightfully so. The residents had a lot of distrust. They did not think that the communities were going to be for them. They thought that they were going to be displaced. And one of the things that happened is, back in 2010, for example, people would say, well, the plan for transformation was successful if you are talking about a demolition program. Because if you drive along State Street, as you do now, it's a lot of vacant land. So housing was torn down, but not replacement housing for people. They were mostly given Section 8 vouchers. But in Cabrini and Henry Horner, it was different. Residents organized and mothers groups organized. And they said, and they filed lawsuits, and judges said, okay, you cannot tear down this housing until you have a plan for the residents. So in some parts of the city, you saw demolition. In other places, it was a little slower because of the court decree.
Mick, as Natalie mentioned, as a demolition project, CHA could claim Plan for Transformation was successful, but also they've claimed at different points over the last decade that the rebuilding of 25,000 units was largely successful. In your reporting, does the math hold up 25 years later? How many of that 25,000 stock was actually built?
The short answer is no. The math does not add up. Certainly not in the way that it was laid out in the actual plan for transformation, which was an actual document. It's as Natalie mentioned, we all talk broadly about the plan for transformation, which I think both includes this specific plan and then everything that's unfolded and what hasn't unfolded over the last now 3 decades. But there was an actual document that was called the Plan for Transformation that was put together in late 1999 and then that dated January 2000. So that was the official launch of all this. And so Natalie's exactly right that the residents there quickly figured out what was going on, that the pace of demolition was going to be much faster than the pace of reconstruction and redevelopment. I mean, that's the easy part, right? Tearing down buildings is easy. And actually building or rebuilding communities is much, much more difficult and has been elusive for the last 30 years. In 2022, the CHA very quietly, as part of a routine document that they filed with the federal government, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, they basically said in this, they just had a couple of bureaucratic lines that the plan for transformation was over. And they said that the goal, specifically, they said the goal of rebuilding or rehabbing 25,000 units, that central part of the initial plan was over. But it looked nothing like what they had laid out initially. This gets in the weeds pretty fast, but because there's all different kinds of public housing and subsidized housing, but essentially the CHA threw everything into a basket.
One bucket.
And said, yeah, just everything, like both rebuilt units, apartments that they had done some rehab work, sometimes 15 or 20 years ago. They counted all that. And then they threw in certain types of housing subsidy vouchers as well. They included affordable housing that had existed long before the plan for transformation that the CHA subsequently was subsidizing, they included that too. So they managed to get to 25,000 units, which was their initial goal, but they did it by throwing in pretty much everything they could think of.
And Jacoby, Mick and I can get really nerdy policy in the weeds here. So,
and believe it or not, we haven't even started getting nerdy yet.
Yeah. And so I'm gonna take the wheel and dive a little nerdy real quick. So Mick talked about this document, and in 2017, I actually had a team of Northwestern students helping me.
It's a fantastic interactive. I'll drop a link in the show notes.
Thank you. I'm glad that you have it. We looked at since 2000, every single annual plan and annual report. And so you had close to 19,000 residents who were promised housing. Where did they end up? So 17 years later, $3 billion later, most of the residents had not returned to the mixed income developments that were promised. So of the 16,000 households that were displaced, 21% lived on a housing choice or a Section 8 voucher, which means that they were renting in the private market. 16% were living in traditional public housing. 12% were evicted. 10% had died. 24% were living without government assistance, so just out there. And then the number to really remember here, because I gave a lot, is that only 8% were living in the mixed income communities envisioned at the start. So those biggest buckets were 24% who weren't even in the system anymore, and then 21% living on a voucher.
And those were people who weren't necessarily getting to return to their neighborhoods. These were people who were
Correct.
Sort of spread out around the city.
And the vouchers meant that you were living in, most likely, in a economically and racially segregated neighborhood, because the amount of money that's on a voucher would only really cover rents in, Black, South, and West Side neighborhoods. So even though those numbers are, old, they are a snapshot of what was happening. And I would say that still, those numbers may have shifted, but we're not in a time where, all right, well, 50% are now living in mixed income communities.
The other thing to note, I think about all those numbers is they're likely an undercount. I mean, those were people who were officially on leases at the time that all the demolitions occurred. But as everybody knew then, there were thousands of people who were living in units, either with family members or living with units that were officially empty, but people were staying in them. And the CHA didn't want to include any of them for obvious reasons, because it didn't want to have to make commitments to any of those people. So I think there were, by most estimates, there were probably thousands of other people who were displaced during all this, who just kind of vanished into the wind. They were never officially on leases. They were never officially tracked. In terms of the actual properties in the land, yeah, you can go to most of the sites where there once were CHA family high-rise buildings that were torn down, and now you will find acres of empty land. And that's true even at Cabrini Green, which you would think would be the easiest to redevelop, since it's sitting nestled between the Gold Coast and downtown and Lincoln Park and other neighborhoods that even during the time of the Plan for Transformation have gentrified even more. But even at Cabrini Green, there are empty lots and there are boarded up buildings. Most of the Cabrini row houses, which are actually low-rise properties, the first buildings built at Cabrini Green, most of those are chained off, fenced off, and sitting empty at this moment. Impact for Equity, a local public policy group that has followed the CHA and tried to hold it accountable for many years. They did a report a couple years ago that found the CHA was sitting on more than 130 acres, the equivalent of 10 full city blocks that were totally empty. And that was just in a handful of sites. That wasn't even at every single CHA holding. So they updated that recently, and it's still well more than 100 acres. So we're talking about the Stateway corridor, I think, is along South State Street is the most dramatic. If you drive down there to this day, there's just meadowland upon, block upon block of open meadowland. But you can find that at places around the city as well, other developments.
So, Natalie, in addition to rebuilding units and rehousing people's two promises we all just kind of broke down, the other promise of the plan was that the city would be more integrated. There would be a reduction in violent crime. Has the data tracked that was an accomplishment?
Sue Popkin is a researcher who has been looking at CHA for decades now. And her high level, there have been a lot of academics studying this, so I'll just talk about, a few studies. Her assessment has been that families who are able to move are seeing better outcomes in life, but children are the ones who have suffered because the multiple moves were hurting them, transferring from different schools, going to different neighborhoods. There's been a lot of studying on mixed income. What Chicago, which we haven't said yet, is that no other city was doing this kind of work on this scale. Chicago was unique.
Do you mean just because of how much we had? Because the federal government was subsidizing demolition everywhere? Was it simply because we just had so many high rises, so much public housing stock, or was there a different part to that as well?
I would say it was mostly that. Atlanta started experimenting with mixed income, but just the scale wasn't the same. And Chicago was looked at from other cities. So you had other municipalities or agencies saying, let's look at mixed income. So, mixed income isn't inherently bad, of course, but some of the problems were, okay, well, this homeowner is going to help its public housing neighbor get a job. Like, you're going to have all these social connections that form. And they didn't. And I think things have gotten better, over these decades, but it was really rough in a place like Cabrini, where you had race and class differences there. So anytime somebody left a garbage out, something happened, they would blame it on the public housing person. If you were in a public housing unit, you had to have an inspection, once a year of your unit. So you had some tense things like that. In 2008, I did a project looking at the former Ida B. Wells, which was then turned into Oakwood Shores. And what CHA didn't account for is like, everybody has to build community on their block. Neighborhood associations just don't happen. Block clubs just don't happen. Neighbors have to get together and say, this is what we want to do. And there were issues about condo owners having a voice with their association and then renters not having that. Same thing in Henry Horner. They were all living in a mid-rise, and there's just lots of conflicts where the condo owners felt like they had more power, and they flexed that power and representation. So there were a lot of growing pains, and there started to be some real community building. It took a long time, but that did start to happen in Oakwood Shores. And I'll say that a lot of Black neighborhoods by default are mixed income because of segregation. A middle-class Black neighborhood equals a lower middle-class white neighborhood by standards. And, even in Bronzeville, where I was living at the time when, these transformations were happening. I'm one of the puppies who moved in, but there was still a lot of Section 8 in the neighborhood. So, there were some class conflicts even outside of public housing. But this is also kind of normalized that, you live in a neighborhood with a corner store. You live in a neighborhood that doesn't have a full service grocery store.
I think that also there were economic problems along the way. And, we can't blame the CHA or HUD for the Great Recession, for example. And that really set things back with the mixed income model because the housing market imploded, the banking sector imploded. And when things started to recover, there were all of these empty and foreclosed units all over the city. For people who are market rate buyers, they had a lot of choices available to them. Even, places like Horner, using that as an example, because that was the first one of these mixed income models that was really tried. They rebranded it as West Haven, I believe. There's been numerous attempts at rebranding, we'll put it that way. But over at West Haven, I know they were sitting on empty units for a while. Even at Cabrini, some of the market rate units were empty, and they were filling so-called market rate units with people who had vouchers for some time. So the whole premise that this would work just as an economic program or economic initiative was very quickly challenged. And I think they've had, it's been tough sledding along the way. So initially, I think as Natalie mentioned, there was supposed to be a third public housing, a third market rate housing, and then a third affordable, which has different definitions at different times. And they've shifted those ratios a lot at different developments through the years, because they've wanted to, they've just had to try to sell units and fill units, and it hasn't been easy.
And one of the other things about the land that's been controversial is building non-housing on the land. And one of the things that CHA has said is, over time, we just can't build housing. We have to build amenities that are there. And a place like Cabrini, that's been quicker. You have more retail that has wanted to be in that neighborhood. So a brand new Jewel opened right away. Then you had a Target, in addition to some of the other retail that opened up that wasn't on CHA land. But on the South Side, that was tougher. And so we already know South Side communities are undervalued and don't have those amenities. But I'll just give one example. When Mariano's opened, 39th and King Drive, and that is on former Ida B. Wells land. And as a resident of Bronzeville, I was excited. Having a full service grocery store was a big deal. And CHA made a promise to hire public housing residents, which I know some of that happened. And so it was a lot of hoopla, like, yeah, this is great. But then there were people who said, well, this isn't fair. Housing hasn't been built. And so how do you balance, all right, well, there isn't enough housing demand for mixed income to be built there, and the community does need amenities, but then you have people who are also unhappy.
And people weren't protesting the grocery store. That's the thing. They were protesting the slow construction of housing, fundamentally. So when you get to some of the other big land deals that the CHA has done, they've done a number of them now. First, they built the tennis center at the south end of what was Taylor Homes property on South State Street. And, everyone says it's a great tennis facility. They also made commitments to, have youth programs for low-income families and this kind of thing, CHA families. But it wasn't housing, and it wasn't a grocery store either. So there were, some voices that rose against that. But with each one of these, it became easier and easier, to a certain point, at least, for the CHA and whoever's in the mayor's office to cut these kinds of deals. So by the time you got to the Chicago Fire building a practice facility over at Abla on the near west side, it had nothing to do with rebuilding the community. As a matter of fact, the justification that was used was, this land has sat empty for 20 years and we need to do something with it. Well, why did it sit empty? Because you didn't rebuild the housing you were supposed to build there. So it became this almost circular argument that allowed the CHA and then Mayor Lightfoot to justify that. But that's continued to be a touchy subject for a lot of housing advocates and current and former CHA residents.
And, Mick and I have covered a lot of CEOs over the years. It's been a lot of turnover.
What actually does a CHA CEO do in these cases? Because there have been so many over the last 25 years. And the most recent ones have all said, well, I wasn't here when this all started.
That's right. Yeah, we could have a drinking game. I don't think any of us drink that much anymore, but we could have had a drinking game. Name all the CEOs since the plan for transformation was launched. It's actually pretty hard because you're right, Natalie. It's quite a list.
Although one person whose name has been floated again is Eugene Jones.
He was under Rahm. He came in I think Rahm's second terms, initially an interim, and then he was given the full-time job.
And I would say, in my time since 2007 covering CHA, he was the most liked out of residents. And he also had a housing background. And there have been some who have had housing backgrounds, but we've also had alderpersons be in charge. We've also had government bureaucrats, and you can make arguments that they don't know housing, but I think the argument would be, well, they know how the city works. And so, finding someone who knows the city and knows housing and can, be performative at the monthly meetings and be able to talk to residents. Residents complain when they are talked down to by board members or by CEOs. So, connecting with residents and connecting with the larger public housing community is something that residents also want. And they also want contracts and jobs. We haven't even gotten into the other wonky thing called Section 3, which says that residents should get a certain percentage of, contracts. And that could be snow removal or it could be construction.
Exactly right. That Gene Jones is very popular for all of those reasons. I think was a great retail politician, essentially. Both at board meetings, I went out with him a couple times to visit developments, and people approached him and they knew who he was, and he seemed very responsive.
He would give his cell phone number out, which I had never seen.
I suspect he had multiple cell phones, Natalie, but yes, he did. He did give his cell phone number out to people. So he made a point of trying to be visible and trying to be accessible. And he was also very good at sprinkling goodies around these contracts that Natalie's talking about, which are very important. It sounds like it's just a matter of politics. Of course, on one level it is, but there are other people who, their economic survival depends on some of these contracts, which we wouldn't see as very large, but are very meaningful to a lot of people. And Gene Jones got that you needed to keep people happy in all these ways. On top of all that, he actually had a bunch of units built while he was there, which contrasted sharply with some of the people who preceded him and who followed him as well. So that's why his name has come back. Natalie mentioned Atlanta. He went from Chicago to Atlanta next. Currently, he's like the leader of the finance. It's like the Housing Finance Authority of the Virgin Islands or something like that.
Oh, he's in the Virgin Islands? Oh,
well, I don't know if he is there. I'm sure he spends a lot of time there if that's his job. But I talked to him just about a whole different thing in Chicago. And it sounded like he really would like to get back to Chicago. And there are people who want him to return. So, but that's just a model of someone who has actually understood what the job was, which was to deliver housing, but also to relate to the residents. The most recent CEO, Tracy Scott, had a business background before she had gotten into housing in Minneapolis, which is a much smaller market, a much smaller public housing agency. And then she came here. It was COVID. Let's give her a little bit of slack. But residents complained repeatedly they never saw her. And so I think it's because they were used to seeing Gene Jones. And then when Tracy came around, she was mostly a bureaucrat, and people really soured on her very fast.
I mean, you talk about this long list of CHA leads. Terry Peterson was the head during from 99 to 2006 during the start of this plan. And then between acting and full time, I believe there were 7 other CHA CEOs in the years after her. What would you argue is the biggest priority for whoever's going to lead CHA moving forward?
Well, I think, we're in the middle of a housing crisis in Chicago, and the CHA needs to be part of the solution, plain and simple. I think in fairness to the CHA, it's not their mission, and they're not equipped to provide emergency housing to people. So, for instance, the encampments that have sprung up all over our city, I don't think the CHA is in a position to immediately help with the encampments. That's not really their job. But they are supposed to provide housing to people, to families, to all different kinds of households that have trouble finding it in the marketplace. That's the whole point of having a public housing agency. And they do it, they help tens of thousands of people through vouchers as well as traditional public housing and other kind of supportive housing, but they just have to do more. They just need to respond to the moment somehow. And I know it's hard. The federal government obviously isn't going to help much right now, but that's their job. And that's what people are counting on them to do. Step up and be creative and help address this housing crisis.
The CHA is calling 2025 a year of renewal. One thing Chicagoans are skeptical about is another damn slogan. But they say they plan to start comprehensive long-term strategic planning at the end of the year, given our current affordability crisis, given our walk down memory lane and all of the promises that have been broken or gone unrealized. In your view, what has to be a part of this next process, this next phase, to keep it from becoming yet another plan for devastation?
I just think all the parties have to get together, the Department of Housing, Planning, even CPS. I mean, that was a big issue. Housing in, schools closed because there isn't housing around, and, all of the students who were transferring, what is the demographic data saying? CTA, like all of these entities, as well as groups like Shriver Center or Coalition for the Homeless, like really have to work together, and things are going to get worse. Chicago is a target by the administration. They're criminalizing homeless people in Washington, D.C. I think creativity has to be in order. And, we're seeing a little bit of that with, okay, how can we take office building space? How can we, repurpose different spaces? So, yeah, I would say creativity and convening to address this crisis housing situation we have.
Yeah, I agree. In addition to that, we alluded to it a few minutes ago, but I think the choice of their next CEO is very important, which in itself has been very difficult through the history of the CHA to find effective leaders of that agency where they're not, corruption coming up, money being wasted, housing units sitting empty. We didn't even talk about that. There's hundreds of units that the CHA owns that are currently empty right now. So there's a whole list of problems. Jacoby, you mentioned
the backlog waiting list.
Yeah, there's like tens of thousands of people waiting for a CHA unit. You had mentioned this hardly seems like a soft landing for a politician. I could not agree more. This is something that is a very difficult and very important job. So whoever ends up getting picked by the mayor and the board, I really hope they're stepping up and doing a good job here.
I can't tell either of you how much it means for y'all to make time to sit down. Professor, author, forever journalist, Natalie Moore, thank you for making time for us today.
Thank you for having me.
And investigative reporter Mick Dumke, thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you for having me. And thanks for just bringing the subject back into the public consciousness. Really appreciate it.
Before we get out of here, I have to leave you with some good news. We are coming up on the final days to see the phenomenal exhibit, Elizabeth Catlett, a Black revolutionary artist and all that it implies, at the Art Institute. Over 100 works born of African and Mexican artistic traditions that highlight her radical and iconic career. A few other exhibits that are closing next week at the Art Institute include 100 Famous Views of Edo and Strange Realities, The Symbolist Imagination. I have not pulled up on the museum myself in the last few months, and I don't want to miss my opportunity to see these phenomenal exhibits. As always, we appreciate you for listening and reading. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow revisiting our list of our favorite movies ever made in Chicago. We'll talk to you then. Peace.